The sky turned the color of a bruise that October morning. Sarah Mitchell stood on her front porch, coffee mug warming her calloused hands, watching the clouds roll across the Montana horizon like dark waves on an angry sea. The air felt thick, electric, the kind of atmosphere that made horses nervous and dogs whine at the door. She'd lived on this land for 32 years, and her bones knew what was coming. Her neighbor's cattle caught her eye. Dozens of them dotted the valley below, grazing peacefully on land that bordered her property. Thomas Brennan's herd. She frowned, scanning the fields for any sign of the man himself, but saw only the animals, oblivious to the danger gathering above them. Thomas had bought the ranch 6 months ago, a city man trying to make a go of country life after his wife passed. Sarah had seen his type before, full of romantic notions about wide open spaces and honest work, usually gone within a year when reality hit. But something about Thomas seemed different. He actually listened when the old-timers talked at the feed store. He asked questions without pretending to know the answers. He'd knocked on her door twice, asking about water rights and grazing patterns, taking notes in a small leather journal like her advice actually mattered. Still, listening and surviving were two different things entirely. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. Sarah's weather radio crackled to life inside the house, the automated voice announcing what she already knew: severe storm warning, possible tornado activity, heavy snow at higher elevations. October in Montana could turn deadly in minutes. The temperature had already dropped 15 degrees since sunrise. She thought about minding her own business. Thomas Brennan wasn't her responsibility. Her own small herd was secure in the reinforced barn her father had built 40 years ago, designed to withstand exactly this kind of weather. She'd spent the previous evening checking every latch, every board, making sure her animals would be safe. That was ranching. You prepared for the worst and hoped for the best. But those cattle in the valley wouldn't survive what was coming. Sarah could see it playing out in her mind, the temperature plummeting, the snow and ice moving in fast, the animals scattered and confused. Cattle could freeze to death in a blizzard, especially if they panicked and separated from the herd. They'd try to run from the storm instead of bunching together for warmth. She'd seen it happen before, found frozen carcasses scattered across fields when spring thaw came, a rancher's livelihood turned to loss because of one bad night. She grabbed her phone and dialed Thomas's number. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. Cursed under her breath. He was probably in town, picking up supplies or meeting with the bank about his loan. A city habit, thinking you could just run errands whenever the mood struck, not understanding that weather didn't care about your schedule. The first raindrops hit her face, cold and hard. Within seconds, the drizzle became a downpour. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed immediately by thunder that shook the windows. This was moving faster than the forecast predicted. Those cattle had maybe an hour, maybe less. Sarah made her decision in the space of a heartbeat. She ran to the barn, pulled on her heavy waterproof coat and wide-brimmed hat, grabbed rope and her horse's tack. Her mare, Dancer, nickered nervously but stood steady as Sarah saddled her with practiced efficiency. The horse trusted her, even when every instinct probably screamed to stay in the warm, dry barn. "I know, girl," Sarah murmured, tightening the cinch. "But we can't leave them out there." She swung into the saddle, rain already soaking through her jeans. The wind howled around the barn corners, carrying the first hints of sleet. Through the downpour, she could barely make out the dark shapes of Thomas Brennan's cattle, huddled together now, sensing danger but not knowing where to go or what to do. 73 head, if she remembered his count correctly. 73 animals that would die if someone didn't act fast. Sarah urged Dancer forward into the storm. The sleet hit like tiny bullets, stinging any exposed skin. Sarah pulled her collar up higher and leaned into Dancer's neck, trusting the mare's sure footing as they descended the muddy slope toward the valley. Visibility dropped to barely 20 feet. The world became a gray-white blur of wind and precipitation, the familiar landscape transformed into something alien and hostile. She'd left a note on her kitchen table, just in case. Simple words, gone to bring in Brennan's herd. "If I'm not back by dark, check the south pasture." Morbid thinking, maybe, but ranchers learned early that preparation wasn't pessimism, it was survival. Her son lived 3 hours away in Billings. He'd told her 100 times to sell the ranch, move into town, take it easy. He didn't understand that this land wasn't something you owned, it was something you belonged to. The cattle came into clearer view as she approached. They were bunched together now, a defensive cluster, but facing the wrong direction. They'd turned their backs to the wind, instinct telling them to avoid the stinging sleet, but that would lead them straight toward the ravine on the eastern edge of Thomas's property. In this weather, in their panic, they'd never see the drop until it was too late. Sarah positioned Dancer to the east of the herd, cutting off their potential escape route. The mare responded to the slightest pressure, years of working cattle together creating a wordless communication between horse and rider. They'd done this dance 1,000 times, but never in conditions like these. "Higher!" Sarah called out, her voice nearly lost in the wind. She waved her arms, and Dancer moved forward with purpose. The lead cow, a big Hereford with a white face, turned to look at them. For a moment, Sarah worried the animal would bolt, scatter the whole group. But the cow seemed to recognize what she was, not a predator, but a herder, something familiar even in chaos. The temperature continued to drop. Sarah's fingers ached inside her gloves. The sleet was mixing with snow now, thick wet flakes that clung to everything. Her hat brim collected ice. Dancer's menere froze into clumps. They had to move faster. She guided the herd north, toward her own property where the old barn waited. It would be tight quarters with her own animals already inside, but the building was solid, and there was enough room if they packed in close. The cattle resisted at first, confused about leaving their familiar grazing land, but Sarah was patient and persistent. She used Dancer to apply pressure from the sides, moving the herd like a sculptor shaping clay, always gentle but firm. A young steer broke from the group, panicking, trying to run back toward the ravine. Sarah cursed and urged Dancer after it. The mare responded instantly, cutting across the muddy ground with the agility of an animal half her age. They got ahead of the steer, turned it back toward the group. Sarah's heart pounded. One animal breaking away could trigger a stampede, and in this storm, scattered cattle would mean death sentences. The wind shifted, now blowing directly into their faces. Snow mixed with sleet created a horizontal wall of white. Sarah couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. She was navigating by instinct now, by the feel of the land beneath Dancer's hooves, by the knowledge of every hill and hollow burned into her memory from 3 decades of riding these fields. Her hands were going numb. She flexed her fingers, trying to maintain feeling, needing to keep hold of the reins. Dancer wouldn't bolt, but Sarah couldn't afford to lose control. The mare was breathing hard, vapor clouds streaming from her nostrils, ice forming on her whiskers. The horse was giving everything she had, and Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the animal's courage and trust. They crested the rise that marked the boundary between Thomas's land and her own. The barn was somewhere ahead, invisible in the whiteout but there, solid and safe. The cattle were moving together now, following Dancer's lead, trusting this strange horse and rider who had appeared in the storm. Animals had their own wisdom about survival. Lightning cracked overhead, impossibly bright against the dark clouds. Thunder followed instantly, so loud Sarah felt it in her chest. Several cattle bellowed in fear, but they kept moving, kept following. Almost there. Her barn's emergency beacon, a bright LED light she'd installed for exactly this kind of situation, suddenly appeared through the snow like a lighthouse beam. Relief flooded through her. "Come on," she urged, voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "Almost home." The cattle sensed shelter ahead. Their pace quickened, and Sarah had to position Dancer carefully to prevent a stampede through the barn doors. Control mattered now more than ever. A panicked rush could injure animals, could damage the barn's structure. She slowed them, funneled them, guided them with the skill of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading animal behavior. The lead cow reached the barn entrance and hesitated, sniffing the unfamiliar space. Sarah held her breath, waiting. Then the animal stepped inside, and the others followed like water finding a channel. One by one, they filed into the warmth and safety, and Sarah counted them through the driving snow. 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73. All accounted for. Not a single animal lost. Sarah dismounted in the barn's shelter, her legs nearly buckling after hours in the saddle. The sudden absence of wind and sleet felt surreal, like stepping into a different world. Her ears rang in the relative quiet, still adjusted to the storm's constant roar. Around her, 73 frightened cattle pressed together, their body heat already warming the space, their nervous lowing creating an anxious chorus. Her own 12 head were clustered in the far corner, watching the newcomers with wary eyes. Sarah had built partitions years ago to separate animals when needed, but there wasn't time for that luxury now. She'd have to trust that crowding and shared fear would prevent fighting. Cattle were herd animals, survival instinct usually overrode territorial behavior. Dancer stood with her head down, sides heaving, completely spent. Sarah's chest tightened with concern. She'd pushed the mare hard, maybe too hard. With practiced hands, she removed the saddle and began rubbing the horse down with towels she kept hanging on the barn wall. Ice had formed in Dancer's coat, and Sarah worked methodically to dry the animal, whispering thanks and praise. "You saved them, girl. Every single one." The mare's ears flicked back at the familiar voice. Sarah gave her extra grain and fresh water, then moved to check the cattle. Several showed signs of cold stress, shivering, hunched postures, but none appeared to be in immediate danger. She scattered hay throughout the barn, more than usual, knowing the animals would need extra calories to maintain body heat through the night. The storm hammered against the barn's metal roof, a deafening drumbeat punctuated by the groan of wind through the eaves. Sarah had weathered storms in this barn before, but never with this many animals, never with this much at stake. She checked every latch, every board, looking for potential failures. Her father had built strong, but nothing lasted forever. She found a loose panel on the east wall and secured it with spare lumber and nails, working by the light of her battery-powered lantern. Her phone showed no signal. The storm had probably taken out the cell tower on Harper's Ridge. She tried calling Thomas again anyway, just in case, but got nothing. He'd come home eventually to find his fields empty and would probably panic, might do something stupid like go searching in the blizzard. There was nothing she could do about that now except hope he had enough sense to wait it out. Sarah set up her camping stool near the barn's entrance and settled in for a long watch. She couldn't leave the animals unsupervised, not in these conditions, not with this much potential for disaster. If something spooked them, if they panicked and tried to break through the walls, injuries would be catastrophic. She needed to be there, a calm presence, ready to intervene. The temperature continued to drop. Sarah could see her breath in the lantern light, could feel the cold seeping through her still damp clothes despite the animal heat filling the barn. She pulled a horse blanket around her shoulders and wished she'd thought to grab her thermos of coffee from the house. Too late now. Going back out in that storm would be suicide. She thought about Thomas Brennan, wondered where he was, hoped he was somewhere safe. The man had seemed lonely when they'd talked, still grieving his wife, still trying to figure out who he was without her. He'd mentioned she was the one who'd always wanted to ranch, who'd grown up reading Western novels and dreaming of open spaces. After she died, he'd sold everything and moved here to live the dream she never got to experience. Grief made people do strange things. Around midnight, the storm reached its peak. The wind screamed like something alive and furious, and snow piled against the barn's north wall, visible through cracks in the boards. The building shuddered but held. Sarah's father had known what he was doing. The cattle had mostly settled, exhausted from their ordeal, lying down in the hay, chewing cud with the methodical patience of their kind. Sarah dozed fitfully on her stool, jerking awake at every unusual sound, checking for problems that never materialized. Her back ached. Her hands had finally thawed, and the returning circulation brought painful tingling. She was too old for this kind of heroics, should have let nature take its course, should have stayed in her warm house and minded her own business. But she knew she'd do it again. Some things mattered more than comfort or common sense. Those cattle were living creatures, and Thomas Brennan was a neighbor trying his best. That counted for something. The storm finally began to ease around 4 in the morning. The wind's shriek dropped to a howl, then to a moan, then to something almost normal. The percussion of sleet against metal faded. Sarah stood and stretched, every muscle protesting, and checked the animals again. All still breathing, all still safe. She'd done it. They'd all survived the night. As dawn approached, gray light filtered through the barn's high windows, illuminating the scene. 85 cattle packed into a space meant for 20, horse and human both exhausted, hay scattered everywhere, the smell of animal and weather thick in the cold air. It wasn't pretty, but it was alive. Sarah heard an engine in the distance, growing closer. She stepped to the barn door and cracked it open. A truck was plowing through the snow drifts, moving slowly but steadily up her driveway. Even through the remaining snow flurries, she recognized the vehicle. Thomas Brennan had come home. Thomas Brennan's truck slid to a stop 50 feet from the barn, unable to push through the deeper drifts. Sarah watched as the door opened and a man climbed out, stumbling slightly in snow that reached his knees. He wasn't dressed for this weather, just a canvas jacket and regular boots, city clothes that would have killed him if he'd been out in the storm's worst hours. "Sarah." His voice carried across the white expanse, raw with panic and something else. Relief, maybe. "Sarah Mitchell, are you in there?" She stepped fully outside, letting the barn door swing closed behind her to keep the heat in. The morning air bit at her exposed face, and fresh snow crunched under her boots. Thomas waded toward her, his face pale with cold and exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. "Your cattle are here," she called out. "All of them. They're safe." Thomas stopped moving. For a moment, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his knees seemed to give out, and he sank into the snow, his hands covering his face. His shoulders shook, and Sarah realized he was crying, great, gulping sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken. She approached him slowly, giving him space for his grief. Men like Thomas, the ones who held everything inside, sometimes needed to crack open before they could heal. She stood a few feet away, waiting, letting the cold morning witness his breakdown without judgment. I was in Billings, he finally said, voice muffled by his hands. Meeting with suppliers. The storm came up so fast, they closed the highway. I couldn't get back. I tried, God, I tried, but the sheriff's deputy turned me around at mile marker 47, said I'd die if I kept going. He looked up at her, his face streaked with tears that were freezing on his cheeks. I thought I'd killed them. All of them. Emily's dream, everything she wanted, everything I came here to build, I thought I destroyed it through pure stupidity. Sarah understood then. This wasn't just about cattle or money or even survival. This was about a promise made to a dead woman, about a man trying to honor love by living a life that terrified him. Thomas Brennan hadn't bought a ranch because he wanted one. He'd bought it because his wife had wanted one, and keeping her dream alive was the only way he knew to keep her memory from fading. Come inside, Sarah said gently. You need to warm up before you lose fingers to frostbite. She helped him to his feet and guided him toward the barn. He moved like a man in a trance, following her direction without question. Inside, the cattle stirred at the intrusion, but remained calm. Thomas stopped just past the threshold, staring at his herd as if he couldn't quite believe they were real. How? He whispered. Sarah closed the door and wrapped the horse blanket around his shoulders. Saw the storm coming. Couldn't reach you by phone. Figured someone needed to bring them in, so I did. You went out in that? Alone? Had Dancer with me. Sarah gestured to the mare, who watched them with intelligent eyes. Best cow horse in 3 counties. She did most of the work. Thomas walked slowly among the cattle, reaching out to touch their flanks, their heads, confirming their existence through physical contact. He counted them twice, his lips moving silently, and Sarah saw the exact moment he realized none were missing. His eyes found hers across the barn, and the gratitude there was almost painful to witness. You saved my life, he said quietly. Saved your cattle, Sarah corrected. That's not the same thing. It is for me. Thomas sat down heavily on a hay bale, the blanket still wrapped around him. I don't know what I'm doing out here, Sarah. I'm a fraud. I was an accountant for 30 years. I've never ranched, never even been on a horse. Emily grew up on a farm in Iowa, and she always talked about going back to that life, but we were busy with careers and kids and life in Seattle. We kept saying someday. Then she got sick, and someday ran out. He paused, his hands twisting together. Before she died, she made me promise I'd do it anyway. Said just because she wouldn't be there didn't mean the dream had to die too. She made me promise I'd live big, live brave, live the life we'd always planned. So I sold everything, bought this place, and came out here with absolutely no idea what I was doing. Sarah sat down on the bale next to him. Most of us start that way. My father bought this land knowing nothing but determination. He learned by failing, making mistakes, asking for help. That's not fraud, that's just being human. I could have killed them all through ignorance. But you didn't. And you know why. Sarah turned to face him directly. Because you asked questions. You listened. You tried to learn instead of pretending you knew everything. That's more than most city folks manage. That's more than some ranchers manage. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the cattle breathe, watching the steam rise from their bodies in the cold air. I can't pay you for this, he finally said. I mean, I will pay you, I'll find a way, but whatever money I have wouldn't be enough. You risked your life for animals that aren't even yours, for a neighbor you barely know. Sarah shook her head. That's not how it works out here. When someone needs help, you help. When someone's in trouble, you show up. Not because you expect payment, but because next time, it might be you in trouble, and you'll need someone to show up for you. That's what being neighbors means. I've never had neighbors like that. You do now. Spring came to Montana the way it always did, slowly, grudgingly, fighting winter for every inch of ground. Sarah stood on her porch in late April, coffee mug in hand, watching the valley turn green. Wildflowers dotted the hillsides, and the creek that ran between her property and Thomas's rushed with snowmelt, singing its ancient song. The past 6 months had changed things. Thomas Brennan still owned the ranch next door, but he wasn't alone anymore. Sarah had started stopping by 3 times a week, ostensibly to check on the herd, but really to teach him everything her father had taught her. They'd worked cattle together through the winter, fixing fences in February, pulling a breech calf in March, repairing storm damage to his barn in a late-season blizzard. Thomas learned fast. More importantly, he learned to ask questions, to admit ignorance, to value experience over pride. He'd hired a young ranch hand named Miguel, a third-generation cowboy from Billings who knew the work and was patient with Thomas's mistakes. Together, the three of them had formed an unlikely team. The cattle that Sarah had saved in October were thriving. They'd weathered the winter well, and several of the cows were now nursing healthy calves. Thomas had named one of the calves Dancer, after the mare who'd helped save the herd. Sarah had rolled her eyes at the sentimentality but secretly felt pleased. Her phone rang, and she answered without checking the caller ID. Mitchell. Sarah, it's Thomas. Got a situation here. Fence is down on the south pasture, cattle are drifting onto the highway access. Can you spare some time? Be there in 15. She ended the call and set down her coffee. Dancer was already saddled. Sarah had planned to ride fence lines anyway. She swung into the saddle and pointed the mare toward Thomas's land, taking the familiar path they'd traveled so many times since that storm. Thomas met her at the fence line, tools already in hand, Miguel working to herd the cattle back toward safe ground. They worked together without needing much conversation, the efficiency of practice making the repair quick and clean. Within an hour, the fence was fixed, the cattle were secure, and the three of them stood admiring their work. Lunch? Thomas offered. Made chili this morning. Sarah hesitated. She had work waiting at her own place, always had work waiting. But she thought about what she told Thomas that night in the barn, about neighbors showing up for each other, about community being more than proximity. Chili sounds good, she said. They sat on Thomas's porch, bowls balanced on their laps, watching the valley in comfortable silence. Miguel excused himself to run an errand in town, leaving Sarah and Thomas alone with the wind and the view. I never thanked you properly, Thomas said suddenly. For that night. For everything since. Sarah waved this away. We've been over this. I know. But I need to say it anyway. You gave me more than my cattle back that night. You gave me a chance to actually be the person Emily believed I could be. You showed me that failing isn't the same as being a failure, that asking for help is strength, not weakness. You taught me what it means to belong somewhere. Sarah felt her throat tighten. You taught yourself that. I just showed up. You always show up. That's your gift, you see what needs doing, and you do it, without making a big deal about it, without expecting applause. You just show up. It's what neighbors do. Thomas smiled. My son is coming to visit next month. He thinks I'm crazy, living out here. Thinks I should sell and move back to Seattle. But I'm not going anywhere. This is home now. This is where Emily's dream is living, where I'm finally living instead of just existing. And a big part of that is knowing I've got a neighbor who'll come running when trouble hits. Sarah thought about her own son in Billings, still calling twice a week to suggest retirement communities and assisted living facilities. He meant well, worried about her aging alone on the ranch. But he didn't understand that this land wasn't something you retired from, it was something you lived with until you couldn't anymore. Mutual, she said simply. They finished their lunch and went back to work, Sarah to her property, Thomas to his. But something had shifted, solidified. They were more than neighbors now. They were the kind of friends forged in crisis, tested by hardship, and proven through time. That night, Sarah stood on her porch again, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. A light glowed in Thomas's house across the valley, and she felt comforted knowing someone else was out there, another person who understood the cost and beauty of this life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Weather service says possible thunderstorms tomorrow. Want to double-check the barn ventilation together in the morning? She typed back, 6 a.m. bring coffee. His response came immediately, you got it, neighbor. Sarah smiled and went inside. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, weather to watch, fences to mend, animals to tend. But she wouldn't face it alone. That storm in October had brought more than destruction. It had brought connection, purpose, the kind of friendship that made hard work easier and lonely places less isolated. She thought about that night sometimes, about the decision to ride out into the blizzard instead of staying safe inside. It should have been a hard choice, but it hadn't been. When someone needed help, you helped. When animals needed saving, you saved them. Not because you'd be rewarded, not because you'd be thanked, but because that was the person you chose to be. Thomas Brennan had never forgotten what she'd done for him. But more importantly, he'd learned from it. He'd become the kind of neighbor who showed up, who helped, who asked questions and offered support. The gift Sarah had given him had multiplied, rippled outward, made their small corner of Montana a better place. And that, Sarah thought as she turned off the porch light and headed to bed, was worth more than any payment could ever be. She'd kept his cattle alive in a storm, and in return, he'd helped her remember why this life mattered, why community mattered, why showing up for each other was the most important work anyone could do. Outside, the wind whispered through the valley, carrying the scent of grass and earth and possibility. Tomorrow would come with its demands and challenges. But for tonight, all was well. The cattle were safe, the neighbors were friends, and the land stretched out beneath the stars, timeless and enduring, waiting for whatever came next.